Eric Maskin holds education of mathematics from Harvard, applied mathematics from Harvard, and PhD from Harvard. Several academic positions, several fellowships, grants, and awards, including the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics with Hurwitz and Meyerson in 2007, several honorary degrees, several honorary professorships, named lectures, several professional societies, including the American Economic Association. He was president of the Econometric Society in 2003, and several editorial positions. I was looking for a short vita but I couldn't find it, and so it's absolutely amazing, his whole curriculum. So, but most important than all these things, he is, and I hope I can say so, he's a friend of our school, friend of EPGE. He's always ready to talk with the students. He has met the undergraduate and postgraduate students twice when he was here before. He met the students today. The students could very informally talk to him about research, what is research about, and he is always very kind and dedicates and has been dedicating a lot of his time to our students and to our faculty as well in exchanging information. Today, I handed over to him a contribution to his contribution, because in 1986 he wrote a very important seminal article about existence of equilibrium in discontinuous games, and that has been afterwards improved by Philippe Reny, but later that has been improved by our colleague and professor of our EPGE, Paulo Klinger Monteiro. So you see how things developed in academia with people in different places of the world in different times contributing to one another. So, Eric, we are really very happy that you have been so kind with us all these times, and that you share not only the time, not only the ideas, but mostly being here with us is very important, because it transmits to a lot of people how you praise sharing what you have learned along all these years. So please join me in applauding Eric Maskin.
So thank you very much, Rubens, for that lovely introduction. Is the microphone working? How's this? Can you hear me? It's very nice to be back in Rio and at the graduate school. As Ruben said, I was here in March. I had a great time, and so it's a lovely opportunity to come back so soon, and I hope I will be back here many times in the future. What I thought I would talk to you about today is some work that I've been doing on voting. You might not think of voting as being part of economics, but I think it is, and I think you will see soon why the same kinds of principles that economists concentrate on also apply in the political realm. I should say that the work that I'm talking about is joint work with Partha Dasgupta. Rubens mentioned another paper that I wrote with Partha many years ago. The collaboration I've had with Partha over the years is one of the great pleasures of my career. So what is this paper about? Well, it's about voting rules. A voting rule is a way of going from the preferences of voters over candidates to the outcome of the election. So, given the preferences of the voters, which candidate should be the winner? Which candidate should be the should be elected? A voting rule determines which is the winning candidate, and there are lots of examples of voting rules that are used in practice and have been studied in theory, and I will mention just a few of them. One important example is plurality rule. This is the method that is used in the UK for electing members of parliament. It's used in the United States for electing members of Congress. And the way it works is that only voters' top-ranked candidates matter. So we look at each voter's favorite candidate, and the winner is the candidate who is the favorite of more voters than any other, even if that candidate does not get a majority of first-place votes. So that's plurality rule. I should say that there'll be time for questions at the end of my talk, but if you don't understand something I've said, if I lose you, please let me know right away, because if you miss one step of the argument, then everything else is going to be meaningless. So do stop me if you can't follow something I've said. So plurality rule is used a lot. Another method, which is majority rule, it's also called Condorcet's method, will be one of the heroes of my story. As you will see, there will be some strong arguments for using majority rule. How does that work? Well, in majority rule, every voter submits a ranking of candidates. So you don't just vote for one candidate, you submit a ranking perhaps of all of the candidates, or at least as many of the candidates as you want to rank, and then the winner is the candidate who beats each other candidate by a majority in pairwise comparisons. So that's majority rule. Then there's runoff voting, which was first used in France, but actually this is the method that you use here in Brazil for electing presidents as well. Under runoff voting, you first look at voters' top-ranked alternatives, top-ranked candidates, and if there's some candidate who gets a majority of the top ranks, that's the first round, then that candidate is elected. But usually what happens is that there's no candidate who gets a majority in the first round, and so we go to a second round where the two candidates who are ranked first the most both go into the runoff, and whoever gets a majority there is elected. So that's runoff voting. Then there's what's called rank order voting, or the Borda count. Under rank order voting, which is often used by committees, say to elect a committee chairman, voters submit their rankings, and then every time a candidate is ranked first by some voter, the candidate gets 1 point. If you're ranked second by a voter, you get 2 points. You get 3 points if you're ranked third, and so on. And then we add up all of the points that a candidate gets from all the voters, and whichever candidate gets the fewest points is elected, because getting a low number of points means you're more highly ranked. You've probably used rank order voting at one time or another. It's actually quite commonly used, again, mainly by small committees. And then the final voting rule that I'll mention, you might not be thought of as a voting rule at all, and there are good reasons why in practice this is not used as a voting rule, but it's an idea which economists often talk about. It's the utilitarian principle. If you think of each voter as having a utility for each candidate, you can think of the candidate that maximizes the sum of utilities. That would be the utilitarian voting rule. I will come back to this later, because the question arises, why don't we do this in practice? There's a very good reason, but at the moment it looks as though it's a perfectly legitimate voting rule. Well, I've mentioned 5 different voting rules. I could have described many, many more. In fact, there's literally an infinity of possible voting rules, and out of this very large number of voting rules that we could use, the question is, which one should we use? Which one should we actually adopt? Well, as a voting theorist, I claim that the answer to that question depends on what you want a voting rule to accomplish. So one way to try to answer the big question, what voting rule should you adopt, is to break it down into the question of what would we like a voting rule to do for us? What properties would we like it to satisfy? And there are some standard properties that any good voting rule should satisfy. And then we can ask which voting rules best satisfy those criteria. And that's how I would like to proceed this afternoon. Well, one important criterion, one important property we would like a voting rule to have is what's called non-manipulability. My title this afternoon is Elections and Non-Strategic Voting. Elections and Strategic Voting. Non-manipulability is the opposite of strategic voting, where voters don't vote strategically. In other words, voters, if the voting rule is non-manipulable, voters will not have an incentive to misrepresent their preferences. They will not have an incentive to vote strategically. Now, why do we think that this is a good idea, non-manipulability? I think there are at least 2 reasons why non-manipulability is important. The first is that if we have a voting rule which satisfies all the properties we want of a voting rule, except non-manipulability, then, in fact, voters will not be submitting their true preferences. They will be submitting some other preferences, and so all of the properties that we thought held for the voting rule will be distorted. If you distort the inputs to a process, the preferences, you're going to distort the output, the winner of the election. So one reason why we want non-manipulability is to make sure that we're actually implementing the voting rule that we thought we were implementing, so that we don't get distortion of preferences. But another reason, which I think is just as important, is that strategic voting is hard for voters. If I'm a citizen voting for the president of Brazil, for example, what I will want to do before the election is to spend some time looking at the different candidates, evaluating their positions, looking into their backgrounds. It takes a certain investment of time and energy to be a good citizen and to decide for yourself what your ranking of the candidates is. But if a voting rule is manipulable, if it pays to be strategic in your voting, then what you need to do as a voter is not only know your own preferences, but you have to make a forecast about other voters' preferences, because you have to know how to react to their votes. So strategic voting means that your decision problem as a voter is much more complicated. You have to anticipate how other voters are going to vote before you can figure out how you should vote, because for example, you don't want to vote for a candidate who has no chance of winning, but you can only calculate that the candidate has no chance of winning once you make some evaluation of how other people are going to vote. So voting rules that are non-manipulable make life simpler for voters. They don't have to worry about how other voters are going to vote. Unfortunately, there is a basic negative result in voting theory called the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem. Some of you may have heard of this. Basically, it says that if there are 3 or more candidates running for office, then there is no voting rule that is always non-manipulable, except for rules which give all of the power to one voter, so that only one voter determines the outcome. Those are non-manipulable because the one voter who has power has no reason to distort his preferences, and the other voters have no influence, so they have no reason to distort anyway. But dictatorial rules are not very democratic, and so this is a very negative result. I would argue, though, that it's overly negative. It overstates the gloomy side of the story, and that's because the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem insists that a voting rule never be manipulable. But some cases where a voting rule might be manipulable could be very unlikely, and so maybe we don't care about those very much. What it seems to me is the important question is which voting rules are non-manipulable most often? Given that we can't find a voting rule which is always non-manipulable, how close can we come to the goal of non-manipulability? That seems to me the natural follow-up question, and that's what we try to answer in this paper, that question. So this, I hope, provides some motivation for the analysis that follows. So let me show you the framework, the model that we use to answer this question. And in many respects, if you've seen some voting theory or you've seen some social choice theory before, you will find just about everything I say to be completely familiar. So let's imagine, first of all, that there's a set of possible candidates. These are not just the candidates who are actually running for office. These are all of the candidates who could conceivably run for office. So it's the universe of possible candidates. And I'm going to assume that society is very large. And I'll explain why I'm assuming this in a few minutes. So this is actually the only slightly non-standard assumption. I'm going to assume that society is very big, which formally speaking means that society consists of a continuum of voters. And I'll explain why very soon. So each voter can be described by a utility function. A utility function assigns a utility to each candidate, and higher numbers, higher utilities correspond to more preferred candidates. And just to make life simple, I'm going to assume that these utility functions are strict, which means that a voter is never exactly indifferent between two candidates. So we can describe a society by a profile. A profile is, which I'll denote by, whoops, is there a laser pointer here? Actually, I've got a laser pointer in my. No, I've got a laser pointer in my bag. Oh, this one. Thank you. So you box. So the box is a dummy variable to represent all of the voters I. So ubox specifies a utility function for each voter. So ubox is what I'll call a profile. It's a description of all of the voters' utility functions. And now a voting rule is a way of going from a profile, a description of voters' utilities, to a winner. But the winner will depend, first of all, on the set of candidates who are actually running. So I said that capital X is the set of all candidates who could conceivably run. The candidates who actually are running are the set Y. So we'll call that the ballots, the candidates who actually appear on the ballot. And a voting rule chooses a winner from the ballots depending on the voters' utility functions and of course the ballots. So F is the winning candidate or the optimal candidates. Now, what I've said is not quite right, because under all of the voting rules that I described, there could be a tie. If we were using plurality rule, for example, under plurality rule, we choose the candidate who gets the most first-place votes. But there may not be a unique candidate who gets the most first-place votes. There could be a tie. The point is that in a society with many voters, the chance of having an exact tie is very low. In practice, it never happens in a society as big as Brazil's, or even a society as big as some American states. The technical way of expressing that is to say that with a continuum of voters, ties are non-generic. And so the correct definition is that a voting rule chooses a unique winner for a generic profile, for almost every profile of preferences. We will not have a tie. Okay, so given this model, I can now formally define all of the voting rules that I discussed. I'm not going to go through those formal definitions because I think my informal description suffices. But if anyone is interested in any of this mathematics later on, I'd be happy to go back to it. What I would like to discuss, though, are I said that the way to decide on which voting rule to use is to first decide what you want out of a voting rule, to decide what properties or what axioms you want the voting rule to satisfy. Well, let's go through some of those properties. I think, again, if you're an economist, you will be familiar with most of these already. So one idea, it's called the Pareto property, is very simple, very intuitive. It just says that if everybody prefers candidate X to candidate Y, and candidate X is on the ballots, then we shouldn't elect Y. It would be very foolish to elect Y if everybody prefers X, and X is actually a candidate. So very hard to argue against the Pareto property. Another property which is very hard to argue with is the principle of anonymity. Formally speaking, what anonymity says is that if we have a profile and now we give voter I's preferences to voter J, and we give voter J's preferences to voter K, and so on. In other words, we do a permutation of preferences. We should still get the same winner because the distribution of votes is the same. We've just changed which voter has which vote. But if a system is anonymous, it shouldn't matter what the names of the voters are. All that should matter are the votes. That's what anonymity says. And again, in a democratic society, it's very hard to argue that some voters should count for more than other voters. We want all voters to count equally. But that's what anonymity says. And you can see the formal definition, but the formal definition well, the formal definition looks more complicated than its actual conceptual meaning. Well, just as we want a voting rule to treat all candidates equally, we also, all voters equally. We want the voting rule to treat all candidates equally, and that's what this next property, neutrality, says. Neutrality says that if we hold an election and now we permute the names of the candidates. So we give candidate I's name to candidate J, and we give J's name to candidate K, and so on. What we should do is to permute the name of the winning candidate in the same way. So if I was the winner before, but we've given I's name to J, now J should be the winner. All this is saying is that all candidates should be on an equal footing. So candidates are treated symmetrically. Well, it turns out that all of the voting rules that I've talked about, plurality rule, majority rule, rank order, I left out runoff voting, but that satisfies this too. Runoff voting, utilitarian voting, all of them satisfy the three principles I've talked about so far: Pareto, anonymity, and neutrality. But that will not be true of the next axiom. The next axiom is the most controversial of all of the axioms that I will be discussing. Nevertheless, it has a very good pedigree. It has a very good history because it was proposed by two of the giants from the field in somewhat different forms. It was proposed by Arrow, and it was proposed by Nash. And if those two say it's a good idea, it's probably a good idea. But let me describe the Nash formulation. But by the way, the name of the property is independence of irrelevant candidates, or independence of irrelevant alternatives, or just independence. And here's how it works. Suppose we hold an election and X is the winner. But now let's omit from the ballots some of the candidates who didn't win. So we go from ballot Y to a smaller ballot Y prime, where some of the non-winning candidates are no longer on the ballots, but X is still on the ballots. Well, if X won on the big ballots, X should win on the smaller ballot. That's what independence of irrelevant candidates says. The irrelevant candidates, the candidates who didn't win, shouldn't change the outcome by dropping out. So this is the formal statement. Now, it turns out that not all of the voting rules that I've talked about satisfy this independence condition. And in particular, plurality rule, which is used in the United States, fails to satisfy independence, and runoff voting, which is used in France, fails to satisfy the independence condition. And we saw two spectacular failures of independence in recent elections in the United States and France. Most of you are probably too young to remember these elections, although they are relatively recent. In the 2000 U.S. presidential election, there were three candidates of interest. There was the candidate who won, George W. Bush. He became president. There was another major candidate, Al Gore, who almost became president. He came very close. And there was a third candidate named Ralph Nader, who made it possible for Bush to win rather than Gore. What happened was the election was so close that there was just one state, Florida, which determined everything, and Bush got slightly more votes in Florida than Gore did, so Bush won. But the reason Bush got more votes was that a lot of people in Florida voted for Nader. Almost 100,000 voters in Florida voted for Nader. We know that those voters almost certainly would have voted for Gore had Nader not been on the ballots. And if they had voted for Gore, Gore would have won. So the fact that Gore was that Nader was on the ballot changed the outcome of the election. That's a violation of independence, a very important violation, because it meant that Nader spoiled the election for Gore. Well, something very similar happened in the 2002 French presidential election. Jean-Marie Le Pen, a candidate from the far rights, spoiled the election for Lionel Jospin. And I won't go into the details there, but if you're interested in that election, it's very interesting as a danger for what might happen in Brazil if you continue to use the current system, which is runoff voting. So plurality rule, runoff voting, and for that matter, the Borda count all violates independence. Majority rule and utilitarianism satisfy independence. So why does majority rule satisfy independence? If candidate A is the majority winner, that means that candidate A beats each other candidate by a majority. If some of those other candidates drop out, candidate A still beats the remaining candidates by a majority. So majority rule satisfies independence. And utilitarianism satisfies independence because if candidate A maximizes the sum of utilities on a big set, it will also maximize the sum of utilities on a subset. So here are some more examples of violations of independence, but I don't think I need to go through them. But now we come to the final axiom, which is actually the one that I talked about in my introduction, which is non-manipulability. So I said that non-manipulability means that voters should have the incentive to vote honestly and not strategically. And formally, that says that there is no group of players, no coalition of players, C, who do better if they send in utilities which are not correct. So let's suppose that if they send in their correct utilities, their true utilities, we get the outcome X. If they send in these manipulated utilities, we get the outcome X prime. It should not be the case that everybody in the coalition gains from the manipulation. In other words, there should be at least one voter who likes X better than X prime. Otherwise, the coalition would have the incentive to manipulate. So that's non-manipulability. Well, non-manipulability implies that a voting rule should be ordinal. What do I mean by that? I mean that the utility numbers that the utility function assigns don't matter. All that matters is the ranking, the ordinal ranking of candidates. If a voting rule is cardinal in the sense that the utility numbers matter, then the voting rule is necessarily manipulable. Say there are just two candidates running, X and Y. If the utility numbers matter, and I want X to win, what I can do is to exaggerate how much utility I get from X and understate how much utility I get from Y, and I might be able to change the outcome. So utilitarianism is highly manipulable, even in a two-candidate election, and that, I think, is the main reason why, in practice, we do not use utilitarianism as a voting rule. The problem is that majority rule also violates non-manipulability, but majority rule violates non-manipulability in a much more subtle way, and let me explain what I mean. The problem with majority rule, the Condorcet method, is that it's not always well defined, and this is something actually that Condorcet himself pointed out. Here is an example of where majority rule is not well defined. Let's imagine that society breaks down into three groups. 35% of the population likes candidate X the most, then Y, then Z. 33% like Y the most, then Z, then X. And the remaining 32% have the ranking Z, X, Y. Well, who is the majority winner? There's no majority winner, because notice that candidate Y cannot be the majority winner because a majority of people prefer X to Y. These people prefer X to Y, and these people prefer X to Y, and they're 67% of the population. So Y cannot be the majority winner, but X cannot be the majority winner because Z is preferred by majority to X. These people prefer Z to X. These people prefer Z to X. So X can't be the majority winner, but Z can't be the majority winner either because a majority prefer Y to Z. These people prefer Y to Z, and these people prefer Y to Z. So there's no majority winner. And that means that if we use majority rule, we have to have a tie-breaking rule to say what happens if this situation arises. Now, actually, it turns out that this situation is not very likely in practice, at least in political elections. But nevertheless, we have to say what would happen if it occurred. Now, one thing we can do is to use the Borda rule. That's where we assign points in cases of a tie. So this is what's called Black's method. The political scientist Black said we should use Condorcet if there is a Condorcet winner, if it's well defined, but we should use Borda otherwise. The problem is that once we use Black's method, or actually any other tie-breaking rule, we make the Condorcet method vulnerable to manipulation. And I'll give you an example. So here, this is the same example that I looked at up here. We said that there is no majority winner, but there is a Borda winner. The Borda winner is X. You can calculate that X would win when we start assigning points to the different candidates. But it's manipulable, because if these people, the people in the middle, misrepresent their preferences, their true preferences are Y, Z, X. If they say that their preferences are Z, Y, X, then candidate Z becomes the majority winner. And these people prefer Z to X, so they would rather have Z than X, so they have an incentive to misrepresent. So majority rule is manipulable too. So all of the voting methods I've mentioned violate at least one of the axioms. I mentioned plurality rule, majority rule, runoff voting, Borda voting, and utilitarianism. They all violate at least one of the axioms. So we might ask, well, is there some other voting rule that I haven't mentioned which satisfies these axioms? And the answer is no. And actually, that's essentially the Gibbard-Satterthwaite result, which I mentioned at the beginning. The Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem implies that there is no voting rule which satisfies all of these nice properties. I won't go into more detail except to say that, as I said at the beginning, this is an overly pessimistic view because it worries about getting a desirable outcome in all conceivable circumstances, even though some of those circumstances, some of those rankings might be very unlikely. So let me show you what I mean. Majority rule, the Condorcet method, turns out to satisfy all of the axioms, all 5 axioms, as long as this situation that I've described here does not occur. As long as we don't have what is called a Condorcet cycle. Well, when can we rule out such a cycle? Well, there are some very natural cases where we can rule this out. One case is where preferences are single-peaked. What do I mean by that? I mean that voters have some ideological identification. And in the 2000 U.S. presidential election, I mentioned the 3 candidates, Nader, Gore, Bush. Nader was on the left wing, Bush was on the right wing, Gore was somewhere in between. Most voters in that election, if they liked Bush the most, they were not going to like Nader second, because Nader was on the opposite extreme from Bush. And if they liked Nader the best, they weren't going to put Bush second, because Bush was on the opposite extreme from Nader. So as long as we can rule out this strange kind of preference, it turns out that majority rule satisfies all 5 properties. It's non-manipulable. I won't go into it, but in the French election, it turns out that the problem from the theoretical point of view was that Le Pen was a polarizing candidate. People either loved him or hated him, which was bad from the standpoint of French society, but is actually very good for majority rule. Majority rule satisfies all 5 properties if there's a candidate that people feel strongly about. But all of this suggests that what we should be doing is looking not at all possible rankings, not at all possible preferences that voters might have, but at restricted classes of rankings. We'll say that a voting rule works well for a domain of rankings if it satisfies all 5 properties when utility functions are limited to that domain. So, for example, the Condorcet voting rule, the majority rule voting rule, works well when voters are ideological. And now we come to the heart of the paper. There are two results in this paper, appropriately labeled Theorem 1 and Theorem 2. Here is Theorem 1, and this is why I said that majority rule, the Condorcet method, is one of the heroes of this story, because as you will see in Theorem 1, Condorcet dominates any other voting rule. So the idea is start with some voting rule, any voting rule you like, F, which happens to work well on a particular domain of preferences. Well, if F works well on a domain of preferences, then majority rule must work well on that same domain. Furthermore, if F differs from majority rule, if F is not majority rule itself, then there must be a domain where majority rule works well and the other voting rule does not. So what I'm saying is that there is a sense in which majority rule is dominant. If some other voting rule works well, in some circumstances, majority rule must also work well in those circumstances. And furthermore, there will be circumstances where majority rule works well and the other voting rule does not. So that is, that's the first result. And I won't go into the details of the proof, but you can check. Dasgupta and I have a paper from 2008, which establishes this result. What I want to spend the rest of the time on is the case where we drop the independence condition. So I said that independence, which is the requirement that there shouldn't be a spoiler, is the most controversial axiom. It has the backing of Arrow and Nash, which is good, but nevertheless, when voting theorists discuss the axioms that I've talked about, they unanimously agree on the other axioms, but not everyone says that independence is as compelling. And so it's interesting to explore what happens when we drop independence. So that's what I want to do. Well, if we just drop independence, but we look at all possible preferences, then we get an impossibility theorem just as before. This, once again, is the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem. So what I propose doing is the same thing that we did for the case where we assume independence, namely to look at limited or restricted classes of preferences, and I already used the term working well, so now I'll use the term working nicely. It will say that a voting rule works nicely for a domain if it satisfies the remaining four conditions. So that's Pareto, anonymity, neutrality, and non-manipulability. And once again, we get a domination result, but it's actually not exactly the same as the domination result we got in Theorem 1, because now there's another voting rule that emerges, and it's the Borda count. So Condorcet, it turned out that Condorcet and Borda together dominates all other voting rules. Neither one does so on its own. You need the two together. And let me explain how this theorem works. Let's take any voting rule you like, which works nicely for a particular domain of preferences. Then it has to be true that either Condorcet or Borda, or perhaps both of them, works nicely on that same domain. Furthermore, exists some other domain where either Condorcet or Borda works nicely, but F does not.
Isolation of both of them, can mix both of them, or Borda and Condorcet are the same group as you showed before, the die.
No, I'm not mixing them. I'm one or the other is guaranteed to dominate any other voting rule. And which one does the nomination will depend on how we restrict preferences. So I'm not going to prove this. I'm not really going to give a proof of this, but let me explain the idea. Majority rule works well as long as there are no Condorcet cycles. Condorcet cycles are those situations where some group has preference XYZ, another YZX, a third ZXY. So majority rule works nicely when we eliminate Condorcet cycles. Interestingly, Borda works nicely precisely when we have Condorcet cycles. That's the only case where it works nicely, when we have a Condorcet cycle or a subset of a Condorcet cycle. So the two complement each other in a very interesting way, and that's how we get this joint domination. So neither on its own is sufficient. Well, what I find is interestingly, there's an interesting historical point to make. I said that the Condorcet method was discovered over 200 years ago, or developed over 200 years ago by Condorcet. Actually, Borda was almost an exact contemporary of Condorcet in France, and the two knew each other, and they fought over which method was better. Condorcet, of course, said the Condorcet method was better. Borda argued for the Borda count, and as a result of this conflict, those two voting methods are by far the most studied voting methods of any in the literature. And some people support Condorcet, some support Borda, but what Theorem 2 shows is that they were both right, because in some sense you need both of them. At least if you don't insist on independence, there will be some circumstances where Condorcet works nicely, there will be some circumstances where Borda works nicely. You need both of them to cover all the territory. And with that historical observation, let me thank you for your attention. So that's an example of the sort of permutation I was talking about, and anonymity. We're switching names. This one works.
We are going to have time for questions from the floor, but I think I'll take advantage of being here and try the first question. Actually, I was tempted to make a first question about trying to think how applying the majority rule would be in Brazil. We could think, for instance, about how we choose our escolas de samba, which is actually a utilitarian voting, that each one person. It's such like in sports. In sports, the judges gives from 0 to 10 to each one of those who are in the competition. But one strange thing that I was thinking about is that people actually do not use a lot of discretion when they do that. I mean, the grades they give are usually very close to one another, such like 9.9, 9.85, 9.8, and but this is a result which this is a particular case in which there is a lot of surveillance upon which grades are being given, and these people are subject to pressure. So, and I think that the paper is more about when you have a huge amount of people voting completely, it's impossible to identify them. So I'm going to ask something else, which is the following. If you do not... Sure. Oh, great. Okay.
Actually, a scheme like the one that Rubens was talking about has been proposed for political elections. There are two French economists, Belinsky and Larrikey, who have suggested that what voters should do is to give grades to each candidate, and then we choose the candidate who has the highest median grade. And this is by analogy with sports like figure skating or diving, where judges determine the outcome. So one problem, of course, with that is the one that Rubens mentioned, which is that judges' grades are public, and therefore there might be some pressure for them to defend their grades. But I think an equally important problem with using grading in political elections is that there's no objective criterion by which we can assign these grades. Before I talked about the problem of manipulability. So manipulability is a major objection to games, because you will tend to like and underweight candidates you don't like. But even beyond that, it's not even clear in a political context whether a candidate deserves a grade of 8 or 7. In sports, there are well-defined criteria that an athlete has to fulfill. In skating, if you do a turn, there are certain technical requirements you have to fulfill, and an expert judge can tell to what extent you fulfilled those technical requirements. But in a political context, it's a much more personal evaluation whether one candidate deserves an 8 rather than a 7. And so I started my talk by saying we try to choose voting schemes which do not make life more difficult for voters. If we require voters to give grades, I think we're imposing a burden on them, because what do these grades actually mean? What do they actually correspond to? Okay.
Is there any question? Because I have a couple of questions, so technical maybe. you're talking about no manipulability all the time, but the agents, the voters, are, you know, no expressive measure at all. So how they can take into consideration their strategic effect to manipulability in the election? So in a sense, what is the incentive to vote in a strategic way, for, in your model at least? And the second question is, you're talking about the last result, the comparison between Borda and Condorcet, but you don't know upfront which one is the best one to use, because you're going to see the group of Asians that are going to vote, that are going to have this cycle, Condorcet cycle, afterwards. So how you decide which one is the best in your second result? And if you permit my last one, if you keep going, you know, dropping the assumption, the axioms, what happens? So more rules become plausible to use, or what happens? Or did you think about it?
Okay, the first question had to do with whether what is the incentive for manipulability. I'm assuming a very large number of voters, technically a continuum. No single voter, of course, can have an influence on the outcome of an election, at least if the voting rule is anonymous. No single voter can have an effect, and so why should a individual voter care? That's why I use the coalitional definition. So we as voters don't just vote as individuals. We think of ourselves as part of a group, typically.
Right.
You might think of yourself as part of a labor group, or you might think of yourself as part of a political group. And very often in political elections, the leader of a particular group will discuss which candidate is that group's preferred representative, favored candidate, and so I am thinking about manipulability in that sense with respect to groups.
Right.
Now
about dropping the other axioms.
Yes. So you asked what happens if we start dropping the other axioms. It's we could have, although it's hard to see why we'd ever want to do it, drop the Pareto requirement. Actually, there has been some literature on dropping. So it turns out that if we drop Pareto, everything I say continues to apply, except that in addition to the majority rule, voting rule, we also get the minority voting rule. The majority rule voting rule is the mirror image, where we're choosing the candidate who loses by a majority to every other candidate. Now, in practice, we would never want to do that. So, but nevertheless, it's interesting to see what happens when we drop Pareto. If we drop anonymity, then it turns out we get various weighted majorities. So instead of ranking all, instead of putting equal weight on each voter, we will put different weights on different voters. And so instead of straight majority rule, we will get weighted majority rule, where the weighting rule is free. If we drop the neutrality condition, the idea that all candidates should be treated equally, we get what is called unanimity rule. Unanimity rule, but with an order of precedence. So let's say that let's say that there are 3 candidates, A, B, and C. Unanimity rule with precedence A, B, C means that we choose candidate A. A is the winner unless a majority of people prefer either B or C to A. And if a majority prefer, if B is unanimously preferred to A, we choose B unless C is unanimously preferred to B.
Right.
So that's highly non-neutral. We're treating the alternatives, the candidates, in a very asymmetric way. But there's a well-defined voting rule that emerges from that, namely unanimity rule.
Right. And the third one is about the comparison between Borda and Condorcet rules. In your last result, how you choose up front which one?
So as I said, Condorcet will work well for some domains. Borda will work for other domains. Now, if you knew which domain you lived in, then you could
should know up front.
Right. So, but if you don't know, then you have to make a choice between the two. So they both work nicely on maximal domains. However, the Condorcet rule, that maximal domain is actually bigger. It's non-intersecting with the Borda domain, but it's strictly bigger in the sense that it contains more preferences. So I would argue that if you don't really know which domain you are, Condorcet is the safer choice.
Thank you. Is there any other questions from the audience?
Is there a microphone?
There's a microphone.
Can I try it?
It is being recorded.
Yeah, also we want to make sure that the people in the back hear you, even if we can hear you.
So you mentioned briefly in the lunch about, so one concern that people have about these different rules is about the complexity, the inherent complexity of these rules. So basically you need possibly each agent to contemplate all the alternatives, rank them, then transmit all this information to some centralized authority that's going to process all that information and compute whatever the choice rule sets. And I was wondering, so my question is about a bit about how much have you thought, or how close could we get to implementing these choice rules using less information? And I kind of reminded myself of something you see on the web, in which is sometimes there are these websites in which they want to rank videos, and they have sort of a very long list of potentially funny videos, and it would be very costly for each voter to contemplate all the lists and to vote each one of these, submit a whole ranking, and what they do is basically have random pairwise comparisons in which a video is going to pop on the left-hand side, another one on the right-hand side, and people are just going to choose between those two, and then once they're tired, they just move out, and they sort of compute whatever. They have an algorithm for ranking these videos with that information. So how much could a system like this actually make it more practical to implement something like the Condorcet rule?
Well, you're absolutely right that if there are a lot of candidates, then first you might be imposing a great burden on voters if you insist that they rank all of them. If in Brazilian elections, there can easily be 9 or 10 candidates, and same is true in American elections. It would be unreasonable to force voters to rank all those candidates. So in practice, what you will want to do is to give voters the choice of how many candidates they want to rank. If there are 9 candidates, but a voter only cares about 3 of them, only has strong views about 3, the voter can rank those 3, and then in effect the remaining 6 candidates are ranked as equal at the bottom. And all of the results that I talked about for full rankings continue to hold when voters are submitting partial rankings. Some voters might want to vote the old-fashioned way and just mention one candidate and not say anything about the others. But again, if you impose that on voters, you would be unfairly restricting their choice, because I might like candidate A the best, but if you don't allow me to rank candidates B and C, I might be afraid to vote for candidate A because A might not have very much chance of winning. I would want to have the opportunity to express my preference between B and C, who do have a chance of winning. So my view is allow voters to to rank as many or as few candidates as they choose. Leave the decision up to the individual voter.
Yes. So you are very concerned about like manipulation in elections. There's one type of manipulation that it's kind of useful sometimes, is when you put all your bullets to avoid a policy. So like, let's say a society that is very divided, and there's one candidate that just have policies against some minority, and the minority is just willing to, if they could veto this candidate, they would do that. This sort of appears in many cases when you go out for dinner, or someone has strong restrictions about the type of restaurant and things like that. Is there a literature on this type of studying this type of problem?
There is. It's that kind of manipulation is very hard to incorporate in a single election, because if I'm a minority, and if I'm part of a minority and this minority doesn't like a particular candidate, then it has an incentive to veto that candidate, even if it doesn't feel very strongly about it. That's the problem. So how do you stop a minority from vetoing a candidate even if it doesn't have very strong feelings? Well, one way of doing that is to look at today's election in the context of a sequence of elections. This gives rise to the literature on storable or transferable votes. Suppose that I don't care very much about today's election. Today is a choice between X and Y. I'm nearly indifferent between X and Y. Either one is okay with me. But say you care very much about X and Y, then I might transfer my vote to you, so you can in effect vote twice in exchange for you giving me an extra vote in some future election that I care about. Actually, this is very common in legislatures. It's called log rolling, where one member of parliament will vote for another member's program in exchange for for a reciprocal arrangement later on. And that allows for the kind of vetoing or it allows you to capture intensity of preference, which is something that you cannot do in a one-shot election. So the storable and transferable vote literature looks at exactly this issue. In my framework, you cannot look at it because there's nothing. There's nothing to trade off. There's no future, so you can't trade a vote today for a vote tomorrow.
Well, some faculty boards do that sometimes, right? I have a question which is a bit out of the box, which is the following: all these principia, these axioms, are of course philosophical. You do not have any type of scientific foreseeability, and will never have. So we may question each one of them. I suppose you had John Rawls to say you something about neutrality of voters. He would never agree. He would say that those which would happen to be the less favorite in a society should have a higher degree of decision because they would be, I don't know how he would justify that, but he would not agree with that. So suppose that we invert the problem, and there is somebody who says, well, okay, you don't like people to coalesce, you don't like coalitions, you don't like manipulability. So that what you're saying actually is that you believe that atomistic decisions taken by independent individuals will certainly lead to a good result. So somebody, based on that, says that let's have an election in two parts. In the first part, we decide which election method we are going to have. And the second part, we are going to decide about the election. Of course, you're going to ask me, okay, but then you're going to have to say which method you're going to use to decide which method of election to decide about. And say, let's say we use plurality, which is a very simple one. And since we will not know necessarily which candidates will be in the second part, because you can make a referendum today about a voting reform like England has done, and you still don't know the candidates, right? So there's no possibility of strategic voting, and you give the people the right, since you believe in their decisions, to decide about the voting method, first with plurality, and then they decide what they want for the second part. And the question is, if somebody is very insistent with that, somebody does not like this set of axioms, could we try to, how to envisage a certain set of axioms which should somehow provide support to this idea? What do you think? Come up with some set of axioms that would lead to given the people the choice to choose, the possibility of choosing the method before voting would be a good idea.
Well, this is of course a deep question. How do you choose the method for choosing? It actually gets back to the question of constitutional design. A democratic society is governed by its constitution. The constitution is itself a mechanism. It should be thought of as a mechanism for delivering good political outcomes. But who gets to choose the Constitution? Well, the hope is, and this gets back to what you were saying about roles. Before we know exactly what the political issues will be and who the political candidates will be, and who we ourselves will be in the society that we're trying to create, we should, there should be a fair degree of unanimity on what the right constitution is. We're all interested in maximizing welfare. If there's not so much to distinguish you from me, then maximizing your welfare should be pretty similar to maximizing my welfare. And Rawls formalized this by imagining that we're all behind a veil of ignorance. And behind this veil of ignorance, we don't even know what our utility functions are going to be. And therefore, if you are persuaded that we should follow a particular axiom, that a certain axiom should be imposed, I, by the same logic, should be persuaded. Rawls argued that we would all adopt the same principles under the veil of ignorance. So the hope would be that in choosing a constitution, we don't have to worry so much about which voting rule we use, because there would be unanimity. If people are unanimous, then all voting rules turn out to be the same.
Hello. So my question is about the president election in 2000 in the U.S. And I'd like to know if you believe that any irregularity as the Palm Beach ballot had a strong influence in the final election results.
I see that you're an election junkie. If you know about the Palm Beach ballot, the West Palm Beach ballots. We don't actually know the answer to that, because we still don't know. The Florida ballots have never been fully released publicly, and so we still don't know what the full correct count would have been. We also don't know exactly how people would have voted if they hadn't been confused. The problem with that ballot was this was what was called a butterfly ballot, where in order to vote for a candidate on the left, you actually had to punch a hole on the right, and vice versa. It was very confusing. So we don't really know what would have happened had people not been confused. A lot of people in West Palm Beach ended up voting for a candidate, a very extreme candidate called Pat Buchanan. It seems unlikely that they would have voted for him if they realized they were, but who knows? The point I was trying to make in my talk, though, is that none of these uncertainties, like West Palm Beach, would have mattered very much if Florida had been using the Condorcet method, because then Al Gore would have won, and not just by a few hundred votes, he would have won quite decisively. So all of this uncertainty was created by the plurality rule method that was used by Florida and 47 other states. It's that I think deserves to be changed more than the butterfly ballot.
I think probably one of the reasons why people are not so much fond of majority rule is that they are afraid that the voters somehow do not trust the results the computer would Because it's not a simple counting process, right?
Well, it's true that for majority rule to be technologically feasible, computers are essential. We cannot count the votes for millions and millions of people by hand. But it should be remembered that there are many other aspects of life where we rely on computers in even more important ways than in elections. Our banks, for example, keep track of our accounts by computer. The planes that we fly in are so we're putting our life in computers' hands when we fly in a plane. Those computers have technology which is secure enough so that we can rely on this technology. There is no technological reason why the same can't be true for the computers used in elections, and it's really just a matter of political will, which is preventing us from using the same safe technology in the political realm.
What I'm saying is that the people could think that the computers had not been properly programmed because it's a competition against different parties.
Well, just as we can supervise, the outcome of political elections, and we do that all the time. Observers will go into a country to make sure that votes are counted fairly. We can supervise the programming of computers. There's no reason why that cannot be done.
Yeah, get the raw data and redo it as many times as you want. Carlos, Professor Carlos Zeller, EPGE. It's important that everybody identifies him or herself because we are recording.
It's just a quick question. So one advantage of plurality rules is that you always get a winner, right? How concerned should we be with a few cases where we have no Condorcet winner? I mean, the consequences for a country that you have an election and no one wins.
Well, that's why there has to be a tie-breaking rule, and I suggested in my talk that one way of breaking the tie is to use Borda, and there actually are very good theoretical reasons for using Borda to break ties. But as to the probability of having to invoke the tie-breaking rule, if there are only three major candidates, that is, three candidates who are attracting an appreciable amount of the vote, then even if we draw preferences at random, of course in reality preferences are not random, but even if they were random, the probability of having the Condorcet cycle, the problem with majority rule that I was talking about, is very low. It's less than 8%. So 92% of the cases we will not have a tie, and that's with random preferences.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Professor Maskin.
Could you please say your name and where you're from?
João,
thank you. Considering
the primaries between the parties in the United States, should America adopt the majority rule? Would it be better to abandon the primaries simply for the right of a Republican vote to consider a Democrat candidate better than another, or should the primaries be maintained, considering that would be less candidates, therefore easier to rank them?
Well, the main reason for having primaries is so that a political party only has a single candidate in the general election. And the reason why a political party wants to limit the choice to a single candidate is because in the United States, plurality rule is the method that's used in general elections. And if a party had more than one candidate, it would be in danger of having its candidates split the vote. You may know that in the 2008 presidential election, there were two major Democratic candidates in the primary. There was Barack Obama, who went on to become president, and there was Hillary Clinton, who may become president after the next election. And they were both almost equally popular. In the end, Obama won slightly more primaries than Clinton, but it was only a narrow margin. Now you might say, well, why didn't the Democrats send both of them into the general election? And the answer is, if they had both been running against John McCain, who was the Republican candidate, they would have canceled each other out. Some people would have voted for Obama, some people would have voted for Clinton, and neither of them would have had as many votes as McCain. So the major reason for having primaries is that it avoids vote splitting, but vote splitting is a serious problem only because we use plurality rule in the US, and if we went over to majority rule, then you could have both Clinton and Obama running for the Democrats, and a Democratic voter could put both of them over McCain, and a Republican voter could put McCain over both Obama and Clinton, and the vote splitting issue wouldn't even arise. So if we're able to persuade states to go over to true majority rule, I would also argue that they should abandon the primary system. It will no longer be needed.
Pode falar. Can you say
Hi,
that?
my question, in your talk you mentioned independence principle as one of the most controversial. I was wondering what was the original motivation behind Nash's and Arrow's decision to adopt it as one of the characteristics?
Well, they both Arrow and Nash actually explain their motivations in their original papers. Their motivations were slightly different, and their formulations were slightly different. So Arrow was interested in voting, and his argument was that if we're choosing between two candidates, X and Y, then only voters' views on X and Y should matter, and what they think of some third candidate, Z, should not matter to the choice between X and Y. So Arrow's argument was basically economizing on information. We don't need information about some third candidate Z in order to make a choice between X and Y. We only need information about voters' views on X and Y. Nash's independence condition came from bargaining. So his axiom appears in his famous bargaining solution paper, and there he imagines two bargainers who had a set of possible alternatives they could choose. And he said that one way that they might bargain is first to eliminate some alternatives that they both agreed were irrelevant, that neither of them liked, and that they should, and that they could then look at the simpler problem of bargaining on the remaining sets. However, if by eliminating some irrelevant alternatives, they changed the way that the bargainers looked at the remaining sets, then the bargainers might not want to eliminate those alternatives. That is, if I think that I'm going to get outcome X, but by eliminating some other alternatives now Y becomes more likely, I might resist eliminating those other alternatives. So Nash argued for independence as a way of facilitating the simplification of bargaining problems.
It looks to me that the examples you have given, the France and the United States in 2000, were more of that the axiom of irrelevance of alternative of some candidates would not change. I mean, if I withdraw some of the candidates, it would not change the result. I think this is the example that we have have seen, and not the one about non-manipulability. Because, for instance, in France, what people would do in order to try to manipulate was go in to vote instead of Le Pen, choosing Jospin, but he won. He didn't win anyway, so Chirac won. In the United States, in 2000, people would not vote. People who wanted to vote for Nader gave up and tried to vote for Gore in order to stop Bush from winning. And it wasn't enough as well, because Bush ended up winning. If you take the United States, 1992, I think, that people voted, people want to go for Perot, gave up to vote for Bush, the elder, against Clinton. It stopped Clinton from winning, but that wasn't enough. I mean, this attempt to manipulate did not succeed in any one of these three attempts. Maybe only in the 1946 case with Truman.
48.
48. That it did work this many.
Yeah. So you're right. In the 2000 U.S. election, for example, what Nader voters should have done, in Florida at least, was to vote for Gore. But they didn't. At least not enough of them did, because Bush ended up winning. My point is, it's unfair to put voters in the position where they have to think so strategically. It's unfair to make a voter, a Nader voter, think, should I vote for Nader or should I vote for Gore just to make sure Bush doesn't win? That's quite a burden to impose on a voter. A voter has to be able to forecast what other voters are going to do in order to be able to make that calculation. And so that is the real problem, I think, with plurality rule. And similarly in France, that there's a problem with runoff voting. The one advantage of Condorcet is you're not putting voters in that very difficult position. They don't have to worry about strategic considerations in order to figure out how to vote.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. Professor Clóvis de Faro. As a question of seniority here.
Okay, it's okay now? Okay. No, okay. Let me try this one here. Okay, the first is a comment. You said that in a sense you're going to have to rely on computers. I'm very much afraid of that. There's some people that's called hacker. They can manipulate your bank account. And if they use their abilities to manipulate an election, only afterwards they are going to discover that, and they're going to have to repeat the election all over again. It's going to be very much costly. This is a comment about relying on computers. But it's just a comment. But I would like to know, for you to expand, just at the beginning of your talk, you said that you, as an economist, would explain the way why you, as an economist, is working on that, and you expand further on the reasons of the relationship between your job and the economics.
If I can first respond to your comment, so it is true that hacking is an issue when it comes to computers. Nevertheless, we have turned over large parts of our daily lives to computers, and society, despite occasional hacking episodes, has done pretty well. In fact, in many countries, at least most large countries, we have already turned over political counting to computers. Not entirely. In the United States, electronic voting machines are widely used, although not everywhere. Even under the current system, the fact that that majority rule requires computers doesn't mean that computers aren't almost essential for plurality rule too. They pretty much are, at least to get a result in a reasonable amount of time. Yeah.
If you allow me, everybody over 40 years old in this room has been traumatized, and then I understand why Clóvis is saying that, by a case, scandal in the country called the Proconsult scandal, in which there was, I think that's what is behind your question. Huh? Avoid it.
Now, your question was about why this is part of economics, and I view economics as the science of optimization, and often we are interested in optimizing the allocation of resources. But that's not the only kind of optimization which is important in people's lives. Political optimization is important too. And the same principles, the Pareto principle is a principle in economics. It's also a principle in politics. Anonymity is a principle in economics. It's also a principle in politics. So there's a very close correspondence to the political analysis to the economic analysis.
Okay. So it's already 6 o'clock. It's time for us to end up with a workshop. I'd like to start thanking all of you for being here with us. Some professors of EPGE, students, alumni as well. Our former director, Renato Fragelli and Clóvis de Faro, who are also honoring us here today. And of course, I'd like once more to say to Eric how much we really appreciate having him here with us and sharing different aspects of his trajectory, because last time was about globalization and income inequality, and today about voting system. I think you also mentioned something about mechanism design when you have been here last time. Or maybe this is going to be your next conference when we have to come up with some system for people to negotiate about climate change or something like that. So thank you once more, Eric, and I would say to you all that you already know. Of course, we are going to go to the elections soon, but the same system is going to be kept. But anyway, we have been exercising the idea of voting, which is going to enhance and it's going to make easier for all of us to think about our next representatives. Thank you very much, Eric.